Well, once again, thank you for stopping on back here to our Through the Xenosverse stream. This is going to be number 5, I believe, of our ongoing and continuing commentary on all things Xenos. And in our last one we were specifically addressing the very serious issue of mental health and how unfortunately it seems to be an item of secondary importance within Xenos. And unfortunately, that's not uncommon in a lot of places. Mental health really is something that's often more stigmatized than it should be. And but when you're in a hothouse place like a cult, like a movement that demands perfection of everybody, with that kind of just incredible uh, uh, compulsion to fall in step and not be found out for your weaknesses, that can be a very often very dangerous and very disorienting place to be. And as we shared last in our last Xenosverse about what mental illness is, and how it's basically everywhere. It's part of the human condition. We want to be able at this point now explore probably some of the more darker aspects of it. We've already started that, but for this part of our journey through the Xenosverse, I've invited my sister-in-law Sarah. And Sarah, it's good to have you with us today. Sarah is a licensed counselor. She is a trauma therapist. And I want to really appreciate her taking the time out of her extremely busy schedule to come by and visit with us. And Sarah, I want to introduce you to Colin and Megan and Mila, and we're all glad to see you here today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Well, it's a difficult subject, but really appreciate you inviting me.
Right. And I appreciate you taking us through this because I'm certainly not qualified to speak in trauma, but in the most general terms. And it's not rocket science, but to help understand it better, I think I couldn't think of anybody else better to do that. So, and as we all know, we know Colin and Megan. They've been with us on our Xenosverse deep dives for the past few weeks or few months, actually. And Mila joins us today. She was on our podcast a couple weeks ago. It's good to see you, and welcome to our Xenosverse today.
Thank you.
It's good to see you today. So what we wanted to do is really get an understanding of okay, this seems to be at the root of a lot of mental illness. Now, not all mental illness is trauma caused. A lot of it is hereditary. A lot of it is something that comes from diseases of the mind, of the brain, of chemical imbalances. A lot of those disturbances come from organic means, but there are those that come directly from trauma. So, Sarah, as a trauma therapist, maybe explain to us and give us a little bit of insight to what trauma really is and how it appears in systems like Xenos or other places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just to start off, I guess one of the obvious things that we all think of as trauma is when there's some catastrophic event. We're aware of war trauma, combat, death, witnessing things like that. Those are the ones that we can easily grasp and understand that would be disturbing to the mind. But there are many other ways that we can experience what in essence is trauma. When we're witnessing something happen to someone else, that's secondary exposure to traumatic things. And depending on what age and stage of life we're at, different experiences can be very traumatic. So that wouldn't be if we were older or in a different circumstance. So within the world of EMDR treatment, we talk about big T trauma and little T trauma. And so an example of a small T trauma would be, bullying experiences when a child is bullied, or when they're experiencing listening to parents arguing and fighting or something like that, very small. Those things can have a lasting impact. Being humiliated, So even though it's a small T, it can have a very similar effect as a large T, particularly if it accumulates. So, the DSM, our Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder, lists very clear exposure to trauma like death or threatened death, violence, either that we experience or we witness someone else experience, or the fear that we would, could die. But when we go into things like child abuse or domestic violence, there's a lot more layers of traumatic things that happen that can accumulate and create a complex trauma situation. And so the impact of many smaller, or maybe, what would be viewed as, not the classic near-death experience, but other experiences that are very distressing, when those are layered, many, many times over, that creates a very, very deep impact psychologically. And so, things like domestic violence, like being in a situation where you feel that there's not a way out of this situation, extreme control and humiliation, power and control kinds of situations. Those are very, very devastating to the mind. And so trauma comes in many forms, and particularly when it's at the hands of someone that we would expect to trust, it has an even deeper impact on us. So, in the circumstance of family violence, child abuse, or domestic violence, and then trusted relationships, like within a church situation, in a situation where you would expect to be safe, and that's not the case, that has a very significant impact.
Right.
Can lead to what we would call complex PTSD. So, and how I explain just the impact of what is trauma, what does it do in our mind? So, one of the ways that I have understood in the EMDR field of training is that we have the ability in our mind to work through our experiences day to day. And we do a lot of that work that happens when we're sleeping. When we're in REM sleep, our brain is working through our experiences and processing what we've gone through. And one of the first symptoms often of something that overloads that natural system in our brain to just kind of work through our life day-to-day experiences is sleep disruption. So when something kind of overrides that system and gets stuck in a sense, that often leads to an early symptom is disrupted sleep. What we do know is that when we're in a really distressing situation, we have a distressing experience, we have a flood of hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, just these stress hormones that flood and lead to that. We experience those when we're kind of in a fight or flight response. And so the reason I mentioned just even like as a child in school, if you feel humiliated or you feel bullied or something like that, and you get that stress response of cortisol and your heart races, that has an impact on the brain where it sort of shuts off the communication. It causes a blockage between the two sides of our brain, and the two hemispheres have very distinct roles. And one side is more the seat of our emotions and sensations, our sensory experiences. And the other side, the left hemisphere, is where our speech center is located, our sort of narrative, thinking, cognitive, rational process is more centered on that side. And when that gets disrupted in a traumatic experience, we tend to, that experience tends to get frozen on that sensory side, that nonverbal side. And so we feel the emotions, the sensations, the horror or the shame or the guilt, and it just sort of loops and just we get triggered and it all comes back like it's happening. It's very hard to put into words. And so
right.
That's a bit of what's going on neurologically when we're traumatized. And like you mentioned, mental health, there's genetic components, there's gene markers now, with genetic studies that we can, they can pinpoint. It's very complex. It's generally not a very simple thing. There's multiple markers that add up to maybe a tendency or a proclivity towards a certain mental illness. But from studies like twin studies and things like that, there's a deeper understanding that those genetic markers don't just automatically get turned on. Our life experiences interact with that. And so if we have traumatic experiences, then, we are much more likely to have some of those things, those switches get flipped. Right. And we can experience depression, anxiety, or full-blown PTSD from these kind of traumatic experiences.
Right.
The more we have, obviously, the more vulnerable we become to having significant, mental health symptoms from those experiences.
Now, on the basis of what we're hearing from you, then, and as we've already known, we've already discussed in our past broadcasts here, is that people are actually traumatized by their experiences in high demand groups where those conditions of control and abuse cross over a line and become very, very harmful and destructive. And that's what, unfortunately, Colin and Megan and Mila and so many others have seen and experienced. And I remember, Megan, you telling us about how, and it just broke my heart when I heard it, how much you burnt yourself out trying to juggle jobs and yet fulfill all the demands of the group, to the point where you were literally were a zombie. You weren't able to sleep. You weren't able to get the kind of rest you wanted. And I'm sure, Colin and Mila, that's kind of your experience too, the way you're kept constantly going. So with that sleep deprivation as a foundation, it sounds like, this is one way that a group like that, like Xenos, can actually cause abuse. Do you guys agree with that, or what?
I agree. So many demands were made on, your time, that I think sleep deprivation was probably pretty common. I wouldn't say I consider it something that everyone experienced systematically, because there wasn't any sort of, you must stay awake until this time, you must wake up at that time, and stuff of the like. I'm sure that, there were plenty of people who did get enough sleep, especially, if you had college students who didn't have classes start till later. If people tended to major in the least rigorous subjects in Xenos, so I think it could be possible to get a full amount of sleep and actively be involved in Xenos. But I think a lot of people probably have similar experience of not being able to get enough sleep. Granted, most people in my group didn't have a shift that started at 7 a.m. So it's hard to say.
Right. I mean, it's like I said, it's a possible, it's a contributing element. I'm not going to say it's definitive, but it certainly doesn't help, for you to be put through the things you through, like, for you guys to have experienced what you've experienced, the demands made upon you, and then the injustices you saw. It was just seemingly a normal thing to go on, and that, of course, worked its way into becoming something traumatic.
Yeah. I wanted to add on to what Megan said. I think, yeah, I agree with everything she just said. And I also think you have to think about the fact that if you're just in Xenos, you're going to 3 meetings a week. So you have Monday, your CT, your home church, and then your cell. And then if you're in a secondary group, you're adding on Sunday. And if that's high school group, that's then a Tuesday. So it's 5 days out of the 7 days of a week that you're already busy. And a lot of people who are in college group are not only doing those things, but they're also discipling people. They're also being discipled, taking classes in Xenos, working, and then going to school. So that's 10 things that people are doing every week. So you think about, how do you have that time to be able to take 6 to 8 hours of, rest? Actually, it's 11, because I don't know if you guys had these, but we had house meetings as well. So that was every week, So you're doing that and then hanging out with people in the church, and then also trying to evangelize to people outside of the church. So it's like you're getting little to no sleep, and then you're doing all of these things on top of it. So people who didn't really come from backgrounds who, they went through traumatic, or it's in their, nature, genetics, I should say, probably ended up developing anxiety or depression because they have all these things and don't have time to eat or sleep, or take time to just be, self-reflect and self-care. So it was a lot on a lot of people. And, adding on to what Megan said, even if it's someone who was doing pre-med, I can't imagine that. I was an English major, so writing was good and easy for me, but people who are doing those rigorous, like, career, or I should say, rigorous careers or rigorous subjects in college, I can't even imagine that would be like for them too, Yeah. So it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And to Mila's point, with the really demanding, schedule of Xenos, you really have to pick and choose. So if you are going to get enough sleep, you are probably completely isolating yourself from anyone outside of the Xenos sphere, because of the, I don't know quite how many hours a week I'd say was, in Xenos, but, almost every day of the week, there was a separate meeting that, I went to, plus then of course, all the discipleship relationships. So if you were going to actually have real friendships and real life influences outside of Xenos, it would be extremely difficult to get sleep.
Yeah.
So it's you're either isolated or you're sleep deprived, maybe both.
Right.
Yeah, but there wasn't a clear forced lack of sleep, and so it's really difficult to recognize the unhealthy dynamics when you're in it.
It was more consequential. I mean, it was just what happened. You didn't get the rest. You didn't get the time. Then you're busy. You don't have a lot of time for privacy, personal reflection. And let's face, from everything I've been hearing, and Colin, maybe you can speak to this point, not everybody in Xenos gets along. It's very hard for a group of young people who have conflicts to kind of, work through those on the fly. That's difficult. So you got the additional level of relational stress. And then the perfectionism that you got from the leaders, how we're all supposed to care for one another and watch over everybody and be responsible to each other. And yet when that happens, it gets messy really fast. Mm-hmm. It's something you saw, Colin. I'm sure you in your sharing with us in the past over your issue related to your marriage choice and everything like that. That got really messy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, even just to kind of add more to what these two ladies have been saying about the ridiculous amount of time spent not focusing on yourself and your own mental health and your own body. I was one of the people, along with plenty of others, that you would bully people into staying up later. It was like a thing, at least in the group that I was in, that if you weren't up until at least midnight before you went home, it was like frowned upon, and you would be like approached for not being a night owl, I guess. It was like you're not staying up long enough to be able to really enjoy fellowship and invest in people and this, that, and the other thing. And so it was a constant, like, if you're not doing this right, we're going to like reprimand you for it. And so then that made a lot of people butt heads. I mean, being somebody who had to wake up early every day to go to work, I'm getting up at 7:30, 7:45 every morning to go to work. And then people are saying, oh, you got to, you can only go to bed after midnight. So you got to stay up for every single thing that you're doing. So then you're only getting maybe 7 hours of sleep if you actually go to bed right at midnight and like are situated and everything like that. But if you went like even if it was like 15 minutes before, people would get it in time. So there's that aspect of all of that. But then on top of other conflicts and things that you butted heads with people on, was if you had any form of differing view on how things should work. So if like the consensus in a group was that you can only go on dates with somebody once a week, if you did anything more than that, you were getting talked to. People were getting on your, they were getting on your case about doing anything that was outside of the social norm within the sect of people that you were around. And so, yeah, it bleeds into every aspect of your life, and it's very hard to break away from that. Even for myself, still, for being out of the church for almost 3 years now, I still have a hard time breaking past some of like the thought patterns and like things that I viewed as important aren't important anymore. But I have a really hard time disconnecting those two things from this is okay and people aren't going to be mad at me if I do this.
Right.
Versus if I don't do this, I'm going to get in trouble. But who am I going to get in trouble with? My wife? She doesn't care. She's in the same boat as me. Like, it's not like I got somebody breathing down my neck like you do in Xenos, where you have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people all telling you the same thing, that you need to do this and this and this. And oh yeah, so you definitely butt heads on a lot of things. And if you don't fix it, it becomes a character issue for you, because it's your problem. And it's your fault for somebody telling you that you should be doing something this way and you're not listening to them, especially if it's someone in a higher position than yourself. So if it's just a common worker to a common worker, you can kind of avoid each other. But if it's anybody that has any form of authority in your life in the church, so whether it be a leader or your discipler or somebody that's viewed as more spiritual than you, you need to listen to what they say. And then if you don't, then you get constantly reprimanded for not listening or not following orders, basically like a soldier. And so conflict is extremely real and very damaging for the person who's constantly going through the struggles of, I must perform. And yeah, so I mean, that's, if that helps at all add to what you were asking, hopefully that does.
Oh yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, and then that is, in essence, all these conflicts, all these things contribute to an experience that's uniformly negative, that wears people down, that intrudes on their private conscience, on their choice, on their health. It's like a slow motion trauma, Sarah. How would you describe that kind of ongoing, relentless pressure? How would you describe that? How has that contributed to trauma?
Well, you're talking about what you guys, I hear you describing is, a situation that's all about power and control, and controlling every aspect of people's lives. And that begins to, have an effect of breaking down our sense of self. And, it ultimately it can happen on a very neurological level where you combine sleep deprivation, overextended schedules all the time, feeling that you're constantly not measuring up, or maybe the bar is changing. Maybe you did what you thought you were supposed to, but the bar changes. So there's this floating bar of expectations, which keeps us off kilter. And those are really descriptions of authoritarian power and control. It's and so what I'm also hearing you describe is where there's not time for outside relationships. There's not time for outside influences, which, you know, if the really the objective is to be the only source of information, the only source of truth there is from Xenos, then they have to do everything possible to quiet any kind of outside influence, information, relationships. So yeah, I mean, that's a very kind of classic description of a total community, or you know, in a sense, a totalitarian kind of a community, on at least, you know, moving in that direction on the spectrum of healthy and not healthy organizations. That is clearly not considering the needs of individuals. You know, we need to have balance. We need to have sleep. We need to have diverse, you know, relationships with family and friends and outside sources, so that we're able to use our critical thinking skills, and we're able to use our own discernment and stay in touch with ourselves, you know, stay connected with our emotions. And so a lot of this sounds subtle, and it's hard to pinpoint. Like they didn't you know, come in and pull you out of bed or something like that, but it sounds like the pressure was there, that if you didn't stay up till midnight, you were going to be punished, which meant that somehow you were falling short of perfection, their version of perfection. And so now you are less than. And when we're constantly given that message that we're less than, we're not measuring up, we're not doing something right, depression and anxiety is an obvious outcome of that. You can see that in authoritarian households with kids. You know, if they're constantly being pressured and driven, and, you know, not getting sleep and not knowing, you know, how to please their parent, they're going to grow up to be depressed and anxious. And so this is very similar sounding to a family situation. Because, you know, did all of you live in different housing and things that where you mentioned house meetings and all of that? So you lived with other Xenos members. So it was really a total environment of this. So kind of replacing a family dynamic.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think we all lived in ministry houses.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And often in controlling types of organizations, there's layers of the control. So, you know, on the outset, it doesn't look the same as you go deeper into it, and the control, increases.
Right.
That's completely true. Yeah, you don't recognize any of it at the beginning because none of it's there. When you're a new member, they're not controlling you. But it's once you have sacrificed so much, or maybe I shouldn't say that. It sounds too but you know, when you've invested so much into it, and then the control increases the more you invest in it, and so you're less willing to consider how serious the warning signs are because you're so invested at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But back at the beginning, when you really are, questioning, and maybe you heard about the bad reputation they had. Like, I know I'd been questioning at the beginning, and I was asking a lot of questions, trying to kind of figure out, is there something to this bad reputation? And I was convinced that everything was good. And then I invested. And then it's so easy to say, well, no group is perfect. And keep going.
Yeah. And Colin, when you were raised as someone raised in the church, you were taught as you matured, as you moved from age level to age level, how much more expectant they were going to make of you. How much more expectation was going to be made upon you. Mm-hmm. How much you were home and had to make those sacrifices, to give more, and to do more without questioning. So you were retained and kept in that environment, and you saw generations of hundreds, how many thousands of young men and women raised in that way to just accept that as normal.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you deal a lot with performance. The more you perform, the better you perform, the more you're praised, and so then you constantly are seeking that praise, because you don't get it very often, and so then it feels really good when you receive it. And so then when you're not performing properly, you're getting the slap on the wrist, the why are you not doing this the way that you were before, what's wrong with you? And so then you start to look internally and see that, like, oh man, I'm not living up to their standards, there must be something wrong with me. And so then you start to diverge of like, okay, so I'm going to act out to get attention now because I just want to be seen. Because you start to kind of fall through the wayside. They don't really care as much about you if you're not performing. And so then you either go into total isolation, or you act out until you are seen again, and then you kind of build up from there. And so I would see it as you're making a lot of sacrifices when you are deciding to be a part of Xenos, because there's so many things that you wish you could do. I mean, growing up in it, there are so many things that I chose to not do because I knew that it would take up more of my time than what Xenos, the people in the church, were okay with me taking up. So I didn't pursue sports in high school. I didn't do anything extracurricular. I didn't go into school because I wanted to have more time for fellowship and evangelism and spending time with the people in my home church and building them up and growing the relationships with that. And it, you can twist that as much as you want to be, it was your decision. You decided to do this. You decided to not do these things and pursue these things. Well, on the other side of that coin, you see the people that did choose to do these things, go to the schools that they wanted to, play the sports that they wanted to. And they were the people that were bad-mouthed and constantly looked at as unspiritual or unable to be a part of a committed church. Like their commitment level wasn't high enough. And so then they're not going to be a sole focus. So they're going to focus on this other person that's made these sacrifices to be a part of this community that they might not even want to be a part of, but they love the praise. They want the praise. They want the positive interactions that you get. So few and far between that makes you continue to stay. Right. It's you get a tiny piece of the carrot, but then they extend the line, so you got to chase it further, and then you get another tiny piece, and it's constant. Just you're in a circle of trying for over and over, and it wears you down. I mean, being somebody who struggles with mental illness and has struggled for a very long time and is a suicide survivor, it's definitely something that I hope a lot of people notice and see that they can do what they want and not feel like they have to be stuck in this rut and be forced into doing things that they don't want to do, because those are the things that led me to be in the places that I was before. I am much better now, and I'm much happy with who I am, and my mental health is much better than it was before. But in the church, you are beaten down to the point where you view yourself as worthless. And until you can get past that, that's just where you're stuck.
Yeah. And that contributes to the layers. Again, the ongoing, relentless, crushing, damaging pressure that this system puts on you to comply, to do whatever you have to do to rise to the top. But it's a continual treadmill. It's an ongoing thing. And then when you factor in also, as we've mentioned, the outrages that you deal with, the struggles you have, part of the culture of Xenos is that every one of you were compelled to feel that you needed to be in submission to an authority figure to whom you are responsible in some way, to confess your sins, to confess your issues, confess your problems. And in that confession, you convey trust to that were broken, that were shattered, that were constantly hinted at, even in group sessions. That's one of the most heart-rending things that I hear from you guys, is that how much of your personal struggle you convey to people who you think you can trust, and have it just turned back on you. To me, that's a traumatizing thing, Sarah, isn't it? That's what you get with it, and this is an ongoing problem. It's a mandated verbal, oral tradition within Xenos, but that's what is traumatic, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're describing, so at an extreme level, when you're in a kind of a total closed organization, which is very much these characteristics, where they control what's right and what's wrong, and who's good enough and who's not, and who's succeeding and who's not, and these expectations are crushing. That's and then there's these punishments and these rewards, and they're dangling carrots, but so you might get a little bit of praise, and so that's very much a description when we look at, again, going back to like our parent-child relationship. That's describing what would be like a disorganized attachment. It's like the person you trust is the person that's hurting you. The source of comfort is also the source of fear and not living up to, or if I don't get this right, I'm actually going to lose my salvation, or if I get kicked out of this group, or I don't please them, what happens? Who am I? I have nothing. And so it's a level of fear that it's internalized. There's not somebody with a gun to your head, but it's almost more damaging because you almost psychologically, have lost your own sense of self, and you're trying to please this impossible figure.
Right.
When a child is in that kind of circumstance, it results in a constant feedback loop of we're designed to get nurtured and cared for as children. But if that caregiver role is also the person who's scaring us and hurting us, then you're being drawn to danger. And so it creates internal conflict that it can result in just, when we talk about fight, flight, and freeze, it can result in freeze, which is like a dissociated state. We begin to disconnect from our feelings and our thoughts. And that's when a group that has a belief system where they're telling people every single aspect of their life, then they can put that in where your own personal thoughts need to be, that make you who you are. They create that kind of vacuum that they can then begin indoctrination, So it's extremely abusive when you look at it that way. And it's heartbreaking to hear, because this is being done to people. It's not something wrong with anybody there, a participant, a member. It's systematically being done to people who are, they're seeking. I don't think anybody, goes to a church wanting to have this kind of outcome. We go to a church or we join a group because we have a desire, to serve God and to please God, or to, serve and have a purpose. And basically that desire is being taken advantage of, and it's being manipulated, and it's being terribly abused.
Right. And it's no wonder, when we understand people have limits. And no matter how indoctrinated you are, no matter how much hope you have in making a system that's broken work, it doesn't matter. There comes a point in which people have limits, and the inevitable thoughts come. Maybe I'd be much better if I wasn't around. Maybe I would be much better if maybe I could escape this pain. I mean, that's why suicidal ideation comes up. And that's what people struggle with. And Megan and me, you guys, Colin, you guys can speak to that. It's how much did this come up when you guys were, kind of fellowshipping with people, and just, people may have been honest, and may have slipped and been vulnerable. How much did the discussion kind of lend itself towards them expressing that kind of desire for an out? I know you struggle with it with yourselves, but is that something that you often saw?
Yeah, so I had one specific instance, and I think Ronnie talked about this on her episode, with a friend who was going through a lot. She was originally from Ghana, so like most of her family wasn't from America, and then she was, I don't know what she was diagnosed with, but she had a really hard time with her family, and then stuff going on in Xenos, and she was at the brink of leaving. So she got admitted into the ER. And then when we spoke to her about everything, Ronnie went to go visit her. She talked about how the person who was studying with her kind of was if you read your Bible more, if you spend time with God more, you won't have these types of feelings. And I think that's a big thing that I've heard and seen in Xenos, where it's people just think that if you pray every day, your mental illnesses are going to go away. And it's no, that's absolutely not. You have to think about, okay, if I just sat there and prayed that, my cancer would go away, it would just magically go away. That's not how it works. We know that God believes in science. And so we need to take that kind of stuff seriously. You shouldn't tell people that that's the only way they're going to get better, or saying that if you do this, it's going to help you get more better. The imbalance of chemicals in our brains, we need that type of therapy, whether it's every week, every couple of days. And then some people also need to take medication for that. So it was really sad hearing that there were quite a few people who were told that, maybe you should think about the reason why this happened. Maybe it's because you're not coming to a bunch of meetings, or maybe it's because you're not spending time with your discipler, et cetera, where that is just not the case. And that's not how mental health works. So it's really frustrating to see and hear about a lot of those things.
Yeah. And then if they viewed it as serious enough, they would suggest seeing a Xenos counselor. And so it's an unlicensed, just Xenos member that's respected for their opinion. And you would meet with them every so often, and you have to sign this waiver, basically, and they wouldn't do the counseling with you unless you signed this waiver and listed somebody you were comfortable with having your information shared with. So even, in the instances where you'd be seeking this Xenos counseling, you were still having all of your information, and anything that you said that you thought would maybe in confidence was being shared with whatever leader you felt comfortable enough having it shared with. And so they constantly, no matter what, had tabs on you. And so then if you weren't comfortable with meeting with the Xenos counselor that they just kind of appoint, they would more often than not tell you that, okay, if you want to go see a professional, go to Wellsprings Counseling. And Wellsprings, I think it was more like about 80% of the counselors there are Xenos members. And there is the patient-client confidentiality, but from what I have been told, I did not ever experience this because I was not I didn't ever do Wellsprings Counseling. I saw it completely outside of Xenos, no touch to Xenos at all counseling. But from what I was told by my wife, who saw somebody through Wellsprings, was that they do still share your information with your leaders if they were to ask. They don't just voluntarily give it, but if you're a leader of your home church was like, I'm concerned with this person, they're seeing you, would you mind telling me what you guys have been talking about? They will tell them. So the patient-client or the client-therapist confidentiality is just not there in any form at both of this professional location or in their home office, so it's terrifying to even think that is still probably happening to hundreds of people, because I was one of them.
Yeah, but you were going to a Xenos biblical counselor, right? A pastoral counselor, a spiritual counselor. You weren't going to a professional therapist, but this kind of paste and dodge is what's going on all the time in Xenos, isn't it? Right. Where you're told to go to counselors who are biblical, who are from within the church, and you're told you can sign a document, but that's not anything to do with healthcare per se. It's just you signing a document, and they're going to freely say, as you indicated, what they want to.
Right. None of these people were able to prescribe anything either. So,
yeah.
So again, that's just another level of power and control where they're closing the system. So they're tightening the trap, where when you do need to talk and get help, they're creating this internal kind of closed system of here, go to them.
The hothouse.
Just exactly. It's like the fox watching the hen house. I mean, it's just more, it's more abuse, it's more control. And what I'm hearing too is the source of the mental health symptoms is being offered as the solution. And it's actually what's created it in the first place. And they're offering you more of that. Just unbelievably abusive.
Yeah. It is. It's a story no one's telling. No one's talking about it. No one's really discussing it. And I'm just amazed. I'm thank God that all of you guys got out with what you have. I really am so grateful that you've made it out. But man, you're not alone. There's so many others who haven't made it out. And I hope are listening today. I hope you're listening today, you folks who are still within Xenos, who've been a part of this tragic situation, and I'm hoping that you're hearing some alternative perspectives. And it's just a travesty. It's just unreal. And they're still organizing, from what I understand, more counseling services. I think there's a new one they're opening up, or maybe already have opened up.
I don't know if it's already open, but they are opening it if it's not already.
Isn't it like just off OSU somewhere?
I think so, yeah. It's their own like counseling office. It's like Wellsprings, from what I understand, but it's Xenos owned instead of being a separate company that just has all of their members in it.
Wow. It sounds almost like a recruiting tool. So if people come in for counseling, they can propagandize them into the group, and the honeymoon phase, of any kind of very manipulative, controlling group is going to have the outside layer is going to be some kind of appealing thing, like, this loving counseling that is presented to lure people unsuspecting people. And that's what comes to my mind. If they're open counseling centers that are open to the public.
Right.
I think that's most likely true. Whenever you would have new people coming out to Xenos, you would, or I guess it's Dwell now, you would in prayer group share about them. And so my guess is that if they're bringing in anyone through this counseling center, all the details are going to have been shared with everyone in the home church before the person probably even walks through the door. And so people will probably, approach the newcomer in a way that's going to very, very easily draw that person in. Because if you know what someone's struggling with, you can relationally reach out in a way that's going to be very attractive to someone who's hurting.
Yeah.
I know that, I went over the years, I've gone in and out of counseling. And at one point, I did go to Wellspring counseling while in Xenos, and my counselor actually had been roommates with my discipler before, which was kind of like, this is a little too, you know what I mean? It was a little
too close, too personal.
Too close. Yeah. But anyway, I met with her for a bit and then eventually stopped when it wasn't, I don't remember exactly why, but anyway, eventually stopped. But then later, when I was in a really desperate, heavily depressed state and needed to go into counseling, and I know I shared this last time, but basically I was advised to get professional help. I wasn't sent to the Xenos Counseling Center, but actually go to a professional counselor because I was communicating, being very heavily depressed and suicidal or whatever. I don't know, at least suicidal ideation at that point. I communicated. And I started seeking out counseling when they recommended that, to get back into it. But I needed to find one that worked with my insurance, because I think with Wellspring, they didn't take insurance, or at least when I called again to try and get back in, and I wasn't able to just afford out of pocket. And they kicked me out of Xenos before I was able to get hooked up with a counselor. And I immediately started seeking out a counselor and trying to kind of figure out the whole insurance thing, as soon as it was recommended. So again, even when they do recommend outside help, I really think it is lip service, so that to kind of be able to save face of, oh yeah, we recommended professional licensed counselors to this person who expressed suicidal ideation. But if they actually cared about helping me, they wouldn't have kicked me out before I could even get into my first counseling session.
Right.
When I was in that place, I think that mental health stuff was just very, people were suspicious of it being genuine. And it probably would have been discussed more often in the church if there wasn't that suspicion regarding it and it being viewed as people making up excuses. I remember the first time someone in my first home church brought up that she was suicidal. She was being kicked out of the ministry house, so not actually excommunicated from the church as a whole. She shared with the group, hey, I've been thinking suicide. I'm not saying this to try and manipulate things, to, be allowed to stay in the ministry house. But it's so sad that you have to preface that, you can't share with people, hey, I'm suicidal. But she was on the defensive from the get-go. Like, I'm not trying to manipulate or convince people to keep me in the house, but I'm, sharing this. And there was a lot of distrust, of the person. And I know I dreaded, when I was getting more and more suicidal, communicating that to people in the church, particularly my discipler. So like when I was contemplating, overdosing on pills, and I'm like, I need to call a friend to come over. I tried calling a number of people who didn't answer the phone at the time. And I eventually did call my discipler, but I was dreading it in terms of, oh, she's just going to think I'm making this up because, my discipline meeting is coming up later today, where there's a good chance I'll be kicked out of the church. And, I felt very defensive of like, will she even believe me, or is she going to consider me just, I don't know. Yeah, I felt like I was being manipulative, or would be thought of as that.
Yeah.
It's crazy to hear that, because at least for me, whenever we heard anybody talk about contemplating suicide, or even like saying, I'm struggling with these thoughts, most of the time people would either take you themselves to like OSU or Riverside, or they would just call like 911 to like have somebody come and take you to the hospital, because they viewed you as like the plague, basically, and they didn't want to have to deal with it. So they'd send you off to a hospital, and then they would kind of leave you alone after that, and would view you as somebody who was unspiritual and unable to think for themselves, because they're struggling more with these thoughts of ending their own lives. They obviously don't care about the life that God could be giving them. That was kind of like the rationale.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, that's how people would be viewed, and it breaks my heart, because I was one of those people too. I thought that way about those people, and I myself was one of the people that contemplated and thought about suicide, and saw myself as like, am I not worth enough for God? Am I not worth enough for these people? So it's heartbreaking to hear that, and also it's disgusting that even is something that you'd have to talk about, and think that you have to defend yourself for why this is okay to have these thoughts, or it's not okay to have these thoughts, but why you need to rationalize why it's not something internal instead of this excuse to get out of something.
Yeah.
It could have been, different for me if I, had communicated, hey, I'm thinking of overdosing, and, I needed someone over before I researched which pills to overdose, to use. Because I didn't know off the bat how much to take or what, so I just thought, I need someone here before I look up the information. I need to be kept ignorant here. So but that was, I think, the day of my discipline hearing. Like, that was earlier in the day, and my discipline meeting was that evening, or the day before, but I think it was the day of. Regardless, not big difference either way. So I think for me, given that it wouldn't have been that, because, hey, that would have gotten in the way of the discipline meeting, which was super, super important at the time. I wonder if with my friend who was getting kicked out of the ministry house, if it was like, hey, we're not letting this detract from, we're kicking you out right now of the house. No, like, you're not doing a detour to the hospital. I don't know. I know with a very good friend at the time, he was, they had him go to, called 911, had him go to the ER, and, go through that way. So I don't know. It's hard when you're going off of 3 scenarios trying to say what was the thing.
Yeah.
Right.
But and what it sounds like is also, so Colin, you described, just kind of shuttling people away that were posing a problem that fit in the narrative, the groupthink. And so let's get them out before they maybe infect the group. So with outside thought, with outside exposure to actual real mental health treatment, if you were to encourage that and keep the person in the group, then there's a threat to exposure. There's a threat of exposure, because if someone is truly a licensed mental health therapist, and they're hearing some of the things that you're experiencing that are directly leading to suicidal ideation, they're going to expose the abusive relationship that's going on with this organization, just like you would with a domestic violence partner or a child abuse situation with an abusive parent. So
yeah, but this is a Christian church. That doesn't happen. If it's somebody's problem, it's because they have the issue, and we told them to get help. So that's the dodge they get, Sarah. That's
throughout time. Yeah.
I know you know that, but
exactly.
You're certainly not a novice on that. So
right, organizations, whether it's a family system or a church system or a government system, can have corruption and be extremely defective and dysfunctional and abusive. And so those qualities, if you just look at the actual, criteria of an authoritarian system, could be an authoritarian father, authoritarian boss, and an authoritarian pastor. And the effect of that is going to be the things that you're describing. And the real truth here is that Xenos is sick. They're wrong. They're abusive. And these things, there is no other word for them but abuse and disregard of people for the sake of furthering whatever their agenda is, which sounds like to control. Ultimately, it's just power. And that's not the Bible. That's not Jesus. That's certainly not the Jesus of the scripture. The gospel doesn't need an add-on of another gospel. Right. Here are the additional criteria you have to meet in order to please God. No, Jesus on the cross was enough, and they're adding a whole nother gospel to it of abuse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's this sort of abuse that is ongoing. It's so mundane within Xenos that it's like after a while you don't want to get numb to it, but after a while you get used to it. You get used to knowing that you can expect to be chewed out for not being somewhere at a certain time. You could expect to be required to give a certain amount of money to show you're in. You're expected to buy that right kind of book. You're supposed to buy into the agenda they have scheduled for your life. You're to go to Holden Beach. You're to go to see whatever sort of calendar they have for you. You're expected to comply with it. It's a program. It's an abusive program. It's a program full of intrusion, and it is. It's what we've been talking about, Sarah. And we haven't really spoken much about it, really, but better enough to know to see what goes on in abusive systems.
Abuse is abuse. Abuse is abuse, whether it's church abuse, it's, spouse abuse, it's in relationships. Abuse is abuse. And it comes down to a lot of times there, in a situation like this, there is this outside presentation that's dynamic and they use information to lure people, and many ways, an extremely abusive person will use charisma to lure people in and then abuse them. So it's the same dynamic. When you add the abuse on your beliefs and your spiritual life, it's a whole nother layer of depth of impact. It's profound. Right. Now they're not only, in a sense, you're experiencing trauma about your physical life, but you're experiencing trauma about your eternal life. What's going to happen to me, and what does God think of me, and what does this mean about my eternity? So it's like the ultimate level of betrayal.
Right.
I really want to second that just from, personal experience. That's how it is felt for me, in that, a year before I was kicked out of, Xenos, I was, someone tried to sex traffic me. Thankfully, got out of that. It was okay, but it was really kind of scary. And then a month later, a friend sexually assaulted me. And both of those things were really difficult, and, are why I was, so depressed in the time up until I was kicked out. But in terms of the impact on my life since, and I've been out of Xenos now for, I don't know, 6.5 years, maybe. The trauma of what happened in Xenos when I was struggling, suicidal, at kind of the end of my rope, and just really begging for help, and to be kicked out of, no longer have my main support system, to feel that I was disqualified from a relationship with God because, there's the label, as soon as you're out of Xenos, you walked away, even if that's not, what you want to do. The psychological impacts that I'm still going through with what happened with Xenos is, I have personally found way more damaging than the sexual assault by someone I thought was a friend, and the almost sex trafficking that happened. And, I would tend to think it'd be the reverse of which was, more serious and more impactful. And I'm sure it's going to vary so much person to person, but it's hard. It was so hard to hear about the way, current elders in Dwell are handling a lot of the stories and accusations that people like me have been sharing, and making fun of, our trauma of, nowadays people are such snowflakes and they will claim anything as trauma, and, kind of laughing about it. And like, I'm more traumatized by what Xenos did to me than by the person who sexually assaulted me, because just to the core of my identity, it has confused me, turned me upside down. I still don't know what I believe, and my faith used to be the strongest thing in my life, the most central thing, and I don't know what I believe. I don't know what. It's very, very damaging to be thrown into, basically, it's kind of like an existential crisis, I guess, every day. And if you're, anyway, so I found it very, very traumatic. And I, even if no one physically harmed me or sexually harmed me in Xenos, like, spiritually, that cuts so deep.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're describing is real. You're describing really what happens in, I've read this and I believe it to be true. It's almost, don't take this, it's not crass, but it's like an emotional, a psychological, and even a spiritual rape. It's a much deeper wound. When there is a system like this that has isolated you systematically, whether it's obvious or it's very subtle over time, but pulled you away from healthy relationships, from well, some people might come in with a really, like no major trauma in their childhood. Other people might come in with trauma. Whatever you arrived with, they're taking that and dismantling it. The process that happens in a controlling group like this is that they isolate, they separate, and they systematically create themselves as your support network. They're your only support, your only source of information. It's just through busyness or whatever tactics. They're very similar across different, it's very similar in whatever abusive situation it is.
Human nature.
And if we look at a power and control wheel, and you're just talking about, say, domestic violence, the first thing an abuser does is they begin to isolate you. And then they begin to take control over different aspects of your life. They take control over your finances, over your personal life, your dating, your everything, what you wear, what you can, when you can go out, who you can be with, how long you can be with them. So as that happens, they're becoming, in a sense, your primary, we all have attachment to, our from childhood, we have an attachment to, a caregiver. They're becoming that. They're creating themselves as that primary attachment. And then what they're doing is they're attaching in a very, very sick, very damaging way, where, like you described, Colin, the carrot, the dangling the carrot. That's what an abusive parent with a disorganized attachment does. When we talk about attachment theory, healthy attachment is, a child has a need and they can go to the parent, they can cry and they can get their needs met. And then now they know that they're safe and they can go back out and they can experience life. And then when they need comfort again, they can go back and they can be comforted. In disorganized attachment, that caregiver is dangerous. They're abusive. So maybe one day they're loving and the next day they're explosive and they're abusive. And so they're unpredictable. That unpredictability creates an existential crisis. It creates a state of terror. It's really, truly a state of terror, because if your primary attachment now is to someone, something, this group that also is hurting you, in order to reconcile those two, that dissonance, you internally have to become disconnected from yourself. You have to now second guess your feelings. You have to second guess, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I should be reading my Bible more. I should be praying more. So, I shouldn't be feeling sad. I shouldn't be feeling angry. And so now you're disconnecting from your feelings. And then what happens in abuse is it goes one step further. And now your thoughts are questioned. You're thinking wrong. And so you begin to have this whole disconnect from your ability to critically think, because you're constantly being told that you're wrong, that that's not right. You shouldn't be depressed. You shouldn't, this or that, whatever the thought control process is. And so you begin to have to doubt your own thought process. And the more that deepens, you disconnect from yourself. You disassociate. You have to disassociate in order to cope with the terror. And when we talk about trauma, there's fight, flight, and freeze. So if you can flee, that's sometimes that's an option. Sometimes fighting is an option. But if neither one are an option, because you are now, in a sense, in this mental prison that's been created through their ideology. If you run, you're no longer saved. You're no longer, you're no longer approved by God. You're no longer, you're no longer one of God's children, or whatever, the things that you've stated. And if you fight, how is that going to work for you, right? There's all these levels of punishment. And so freeze and disassociation are what people are left with inside this level of abuse, this kind of a complete and total abusive environment. Freeze is what's left. Or self-destruction. When you are struggling and you're still fighting against this, and really, this thought of I'm going to hurt myself rather than go even deeper, is a survival. It sounds twisted, but it's almost like you're still fighting. What they want is complete submission. And the people, Megan, you described your discipler as somebody who, when you were at your lowest point, she hurt you more. She took this, suicide ideology and laughed and didn't take it seriously. That's somebody who is completely disconnected from humanity, from being human, from having compassion, from having empathy. This is somebody who has completely sold out, completely submitted, surrendered their own thought process over to the group. And so that's how they're able to be cruel for the purpose of the group, for the perpetuation of this controlling environment. They no longer even have human compassion. So you are absolutely spot on. This damage is so incredibly deep. You are not off at all to feel like this is worse than a sexual assault or something like that. This is profoundly traumatic. And it does disconnect you from, this kind of total thought control and complete power and control over someone's life leads to terror and then despair and just a complete collapse internally of your thinking, your feelings, your identity. And the hope is, our brains are malleable and we have the ability to heal. It's a journey, but you're still there. It's, in a sense, Xenos has been, kind of planted in you, and it's sitting on you, and it's a process to lift that off and peel that away and reconnect with yourself. But you are there. And if I were to say anything, it's a challenging process, and not every therapist is trained and equipped to handle complex PTSD. But what you've experienced and described is complex PTSD. And there's a whole additional layer of symptoms that can come with that. And this sort of existential crisis is part of that. Having difficulty with trust, having difficulty with, reconnecting with who you are. All of those are very, very descriptive of some of the experiences people have with complex PTSD. So don't minimize it, and definitely don't give up on finding the right kind of help to go all the distance and healing that complex PTSD and being able to get back to the core of who you are, because it is.
Right. I knew a man that had left the Mormon church many years ago, and he then lost his son to leukemia, 6-year-old boy. And he later would tell me that the pain of losing his ability to connect with that belief system was far more damaging, far more agonizing than losing his own son. So that kind of pain that you, Megan, are describing, Mila, you've been fighting through, Colin, you've seen, I mean, that kind of pain is real, regardless what the keepers at Xenos want you to believe. It's a very real thing. We have believed your report, as the Bible says. And that's one of the things that's been so humbling to me, is that so many people have written to us and said they've thanked us for talking about Xenos in the way we have, and bringing it out and believing them, letting them tell their story. And that's what we want to do here. Mila, that's why we call it. That's why we all spent the time we've done. And if we're in seeing people struggling with trying to deal with complex PTSD as a result of their involvement with a church that's supposedly preaching the good news on the abundant life of Jesus Christ, then we're seeing something entirely different, I think, Sarah. I don't buy it for a moment. This is not the Christian faith that I know about. This is hell. This is a hell on earth. This is something that people need to understand is real. It's ongoing. It's not made up. It's a continual, ongoing crisis. And again, it's so mundane, it's so ordinary within Xenos. People don't even think about it anymore until there's an unfortunate obituary or something like that. I mean, Sarah, you're taking that time. I mean, what else can you say to people who are maybe listening, who are right where we are now? What can you do to help provide? I mean, what's the way out of something like this? If you recognize you've got a problem, I think that's the first thing, and you need help. What's the next step of help for someone who's realized, who they may have turned the corner and realized, hey, I need the change. I've been in this situation too long. What would you suggest? What would you offer as maybe a roadmap for people, other than the wonderful things you shared with us here already?
I think, when you're in a complete belief system like this, where it's a total society, it's a totalitarian kind of ideology, their version of Christianity, and you're conditioned to only hear them and keep that feedback loop closed. One of the most powerful things is reconnecting. Is there someone who is safe in your life from outside of Xenos? Is there someone from your family or your friends from outside, completely disconnected outside of the system, that you can connect to? If not, is there a therapist that's not part of this system, that is a licensed, qualified psychotherapist that's not in the system? Begin to get outside perspective from someone, because your perspective has been very conditioned without even realizing it. It's a bit like the frog in the kettle. You kind of get boiled to think only the way that you're allowed to think. In a closed system. And so getting some outside information is powerful, and reconnecting with any, like when I talk about secure attachment, any support system outside of this system, and hear them and hear their concern, and almost like being thrown a safety raft out, in the ocean. Grab it and listen and begin to break the spell of this closed thought process. And that would be the one thing, that they can only thrive as long as they control the information, they control the connections, they control who your loyalty lies with. And if you're disloyal in any kind of way, or you're of no use to them because you're not submissive enough, they'll boot you out and blame you and blame the victim. And so it's just one more indicator of how sick this is. It's incredibly destructive, and it is, I think the key to in healing is knowing that the abuser is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The person who has been abused is not wrong. It's the abuser.
Recognize that there is an abuser.
There is an abuser. This
wasn't their fault.
Yes. And there's nothing you did to deserve it. It happens. If you really start to research and dig into who's in abusive groups or abusive relationships, in cults, it's typically very high IQ, upper middle class, intelligent, bright people, college students, PhD students, Ivy League students. There's not a profile of who can get abused. It's the abuser that there is a profile on.
Right.
The very predictable profile on. And the things that you've described just tick off every box of an authoritarian, power and control, abusive system or person. Obviously, it starts with a leader who's indoctrinated people, and it just trickles down to a complete system. In a case like Xenos, what I'm hearing is it's an entire system of abuse of power and control.
Yeah.
And it starts with a very sick individual.
I don't think you have any argument here on that, and we certainly will be discussing that more as times go on. But we've certainly had enough people comment upon the leadership of Xenos and just how just fiendishly organized it is, how relentless it is in keeping people under its thumb. And it all begins with Dennis McCallum, who has started Xenos with Gary DeLashmutt, and they've created a incredible layer of leadership that have perpetuated his model of control and authoritarianism. And that's the news. It's not the news, it's the reality. It's something I hope to present on here at a conference here not too long from now. But it's just so mundane. It's so ordinary that people don't even think for a moment. They don't even suspect for a moment that nice, sweet church with all those great Christian schools and all that activity and young life and all those other places, they can't begin to suspect that such things could go on. But all contrary.
Often, what you see is there's generally, and this is what's so deceiving, is that maybe the teaching is, for the most part, biblical or orthodox, but so you have a glass of water and it's refreshing and it's wonderful and it looks great, but it's got 1 drop of arsenic in it. So if you drink it, doesn't matter. You're going to die. All it takes is 1 drop of arsenic to poison the well, and to very subtly, often it's this subtle deception. And that's true in so many different examples of abusive relationships, where one thing is off and then it grows from there. And, if I were to say anything, it's the dimensions, the characteristics of cults. It doesn't matter whether they're religious or they're political, they're radical terrorist groups, whatever. They use the same process, and this is a process you're describing.
Right.
They start off with authoritarian leadership, with charismatic leadership that lures unsuspecting people who have a good purpose for wanting to join and wanting to be a part of something. And then they dominate, they isolate, they control. And then you begin to be indoctrinated that they have special insight, they've got special revelation, they've got, the most unique church or the most unique ideology. And so you're going to be closer to God than anywhere else if you join this cause. And then they begin to brainwash. They begin to do the things that we've talked about. And the outcome is that you are isolated from the world, because Xenos is the world, right? Outside of the world, everybody's just a loser. They're just lost, or they're missing out on this great thing. So anybody not in Xenos is just whatever, one of the one of the ones we pity, right? Because they've missed out. So you're isolated from the outside world, but then you're also isolated from real true relationship, because everybody is designed to betray you. You can't trust anybody. You don't know who you can trust. You are not allowed to really have authentic relationships. You're cut off from your outside relationships, whether it's their busyness or exhaustion or whatever. They make sure that you get cut off from the outside. And then ultimately you get cut off from yourself. You become the group, you become the ideology, and you lose yourself. So it's just an ultimate process of evil. But it's as old as time, and it's always had the same outcome. It's destructive. It's destruction. And so just realizing that you're not alone, realizing that you didn't do this, you didn't do anything to cause this, and that there's hope. Connect with the outside, don't give up.
Right. Get some help.
Get help. Absolutely.
Don't wait another moment. Get some help.
Get
from
some
outside that loop.
Yep. And talk about complex PTSD and looking for, really trained and qualified professional help that understands complex PTSD.
Right. Does anybody have any questions or comments you'd like to make? I know we never decide how long we're going to do these, but we're going on almost closing in on 2 hours. So, but I really appreciate every one of you being here to share today. And I just wonder if any closing thoughts or questions maybe you had for Sarah that maybe she could have to share with us. I don't know what your time's like, Sarah. I mean, I'm wide open. I'm not working today, so but I know you guys have your own things to do. But does anyone have any comments?
I would like to, address people who are in Dwell currently. So if you're listening and maybe you hear some of what we've shared and you haven't experienced anything so extreme, it's really easy to think, well, it's unfortunate you had that bad experience, but my experience, on the other hand, is so positive. I really would like to just point out that being a part of a group that has such systematic issues as this is not a life-giving thing for other people who are maybe more vulnerable than you. They may experience stuff to a horrible degree. We didn't even actually touch today on people who were successful with attempting suicide in Xenos, because we know that's quite rampant. But also consider that, and prior to, dealing with some, traumatic events, like sexual traumatic events, like for me outside of Xenos that I mentioned, I was doing really well in Xenos. And, after the spiral down, things got really dark really quickly. When I needed support the most is when I was abandoned. And so even if things don't seem so horrible to you now, I want to stress that this is not a safe group to be a part of. If you go through the wrong kind of struggle or trauma, according to Xenos, things can spiral very quickly. And even if I don't know you, I care about you. And please consider getting out of this group. I don't want anyone to have a traumatic experience like this from Dwell anymore.
Right. Thank you, Megan. Because that potential is so high. There's so many people that email and post and say, "Oh, my experience was totally positive. I didn't see any of that." Well, they're either out of touch with reality or they haven't yet seen it, or haven't because they haven't wanted to see it. They've accepted explanation of the way things are. So, but anyway, it's not my last word. So, anybody else? Colin, Mila, any of you guys would like to comment or share, ask questions? Let me put you on the spot.
I mean, if we're gonna add anything else, with what Megan was saying as well, I mean, if you're currently in counseling through Xenos that they have told you to do, or you're trying to seek help, but it just doesn't feel like it's going the right way, or it doesn't feel like it's helpful, try and seek something outside of it. Like what Sarah was saying, go outside of the church, outside of the organization, and it'll open your eyes. It opened my eyes. As soon as I went outside of Xenos counseling, I realized that there are people that actually care and also understand emotions and feelings and traumatic events and can recognize them and call things out. People in Xenos aren't going to tell you that this situation that you're in was messed up, because they're just as sold on the ideology that you're a part of. So they're not going to say anything different from what you're already experiencing. And then also, I know it's terrifying to make that leap to do anything outside of the church, or even like what Megan is saying is to get out. You can rebuild.
Yes.
You're not lost after you leave. I know it's terrifying thinking about it because you have friends and support and whatever else you may have that you find so valuable. When you leave, you'll realize that the value that you put in them, they don't put back in you. And you can rebuild with something that is far more valuable and so much better for yourself and for others if you do that.
Right. Mm-hmm. There is life else beyond Xenos, isn't it? There is life beyond it.
Yeah.
A good life.
Mm-hmm.
A good one.
Very good life.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Also, get out before you're emotionally scarred and question who you are.
Yeah.
It sounds like it'd be a lot better. So don't wait till you.
A lot easier to figure things out.
It is. Yeah. Yes.
Please.
Yeah.
I would like to say, agreeing with what everyone else just said, but also, if you do need people to talk to, I feel like any of us here or any people in our little support group are here to talk. I've had a couple people reach out already, so that's been really cool just to be able to give a little bit of advice on how you can get out, because it is scary. I will not lie about that. It is scary leaving, but I don't want people to allow that fear to stop you from leaving, because it took me 8 years to get out, and if I didn't allow that fear to stop, I would have been gone probably 2 months in. And I don't want to see people's lives damaged because of Xenos. So just being aware of the tactics that they use to kind of keep you from, whether it's leaving or whether it's seeking help outside of the biblical counseling. But your mental health is important. That is the number one thing. Do not let anyone in the church or anyone in life tell you that it's not. It is scary to have people constantly make you feel like you're a snowflake or too emotional, but in reality it's just trauma, or your mental illness is just flaring up, or your mental health isn't in good shape. So yeah, I don't want to say don't be fearful, because it is scary, but know that there are people who left, so many people who left, who are here to be your community. If you feel like you're going to lose your friends, you got people here who want to be your friends. If you feel like you're leaving God, you're not. Xenos is not Jesus. So please, we got to get that out of our mindsets. I think that's something that a lot of us fall over in there. So yeah, that's my big takeaway. I guess those three, of just not allowing that fear to stop leaving, and then knowing that you are worth something, and that your mental health is extremely important.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, there's some powerful books. And so if information and reading and research is something that you're open to, people that have gotten out, people that are still in. One of my professors back in the 80s, Dr. Enroth, I graduated from Wheaton College, but I did a semester at Westmont, and Ronald Enroth wrote a book, Churches That Abuse, 30 years ago, and it's as
book
today as it was the day he wrote it. And he also wrote Recovering from Churches That Abuse. And so there's some great information, and there is power in knowing that you're not alone. That is a really, really powerful thing, to know that you're not alone and that people do recover. Yeah. So I would encourage getting Dr. Ronald Enroth's books. There's other books on cults and mind control. And I think the most profound thing is, if you're open to reading, the more you read, the more you'll see that there's nothing new under the sun, and authoritarian cults are the same, and they're always going to be the same. And this, what you've described, is absolutely that. And there's Dr. Stephen Hassan, who wrote Combating Cult Mind Control. That book is a good read as well. There's another book.
I cut my teeth in all those in the 90s.
Yep. And so,
look.
Yeah, they're great. There's another one, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing. And that one is excellent. Alexandra Stein. And again, it doesn't even, it applies to, there can be a cult of two. It's about power and control. And fortunately, this sounds like it's impacted thousands. And so the word needs to be out. This is not okay. What you're experiencing, if you're still in this situation. And I agree, Megan, with what you said, that not everybody might have the same experience, but there's levels of involvement. And I'm guessing, like most organizations, if you're not in the deeper inner circle, you might not have the full experience. If you're out on the fun layer of the kind of propaganda public face, you might not experience this yet, but the goal is to take you there. Right. So, yeah.
If you play with fire, you're going to get burned at some level, some way soon. And being burned is never fun.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for a long time. Since 1982, I've been administering and trying to help people who've been through these horrible situations, and seeing people struggle with their very reality after encountering such things like this is always, it's saddening, it's challenging, it's heartbreaking, and it can be mediated by getting real.
Yeah.
It can be mediated by confronting truth. As a matter of fact, several of those books, Sarah, they're on our website. You can download PDF files, so you can take them in your smartphone for you to read.
That's great.
But I want to once again just reiterate that if this has been a tough situation, this has been a tough conversation for you, please find someone to talk to. We're here. Colin, Megan, Mia. I mean, you guys have. There may be people reaching out to you. That's wonderful. I want to encourage that. If you don't know how to get a hold of them, you can contact us to our assistance inbox. If you'd like to speak with Sarah, maybe have a note for her, you can send it on to help@spiritwatch.org, and any email you get will be sent immediately straight to them. I won't hold on to it. I won't act on it. I won't answer it. If you send it there, it'll go straight to them, and then at that point they can correspond with you, because that's what we want. We want to see conversations start, and by the grace of God, we've been seeing them going on. And I want to once again thank each and every one of you, Sarah, especially you, for our special guest here, Colin, Megan, and me. You guys, I so appreciate your willingness to be transparent and to share what we know is certainly a tough time, a tough thing to deal with in your life. But as we said, we're not alone. And in that sharing, we are hopeful, always optimistic that people will listen and will see themselves in your story, in these stories. And that's one of the great things that we've seen. So many have. And by the grace of God, we're hoping more people will get help. Once again, thank you. And hopefully we'll get a chance to do it again, guys. And Sarah, look forward to seeing you real soon. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
After such a heavy conversation tonight, I just want to remind anybody who is watching or listening that you are loved and you are worthy of that love. That's not based around your performance. It's not conditioned based on your moods, your elation, or your depression. It's a unchangeable love that is inherent to who you are. And you deserve ruthless compassion. And I hope that you will treat yourself with such compassion. We believe you, and there is no moral failure to any mental health diagnosis. There is hope, and there is healing. Healing doesn't happen all at once. Healing is a bunch of tiny little steps, one after another, that you approach with kindness and curiosity, not shame. And if you are struggling, I am begging you to reach out. We are not meant to suffer in silence or solitude. If you are looking for resources, a great starting point is the leavingdwell.com website. There is a resources tab, and under that you will find all kinds of stuff, including counseling, counselors, a counseling list, and support groups. And there are educational books and websites, and I believe there are even housing and financial resources listed on that page as well. So that's a great place to start, especially if you're looking to find a trauma-informed therapist. Everybody who is on that list has been seen or used by someone who has experienced a mental health diagnosis or has been involved in Xenos and Dwell and dealt with the trauma in the aftermath of that. So they all come recommended. And then if you are struggling with any suicidal thoughts or feelings, please reach out to the suicide hotline, which is now the 3-digit dialing code 988, which you can call or text at any time, 24/7. And I look forward to continuing this conversation as we collectively move forward towards healing as a community.